Hello and welcome to CodeSlicing. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a simple and awesome way of creating activity indicators like this one here. I think you'll agree there's nothing worse than activity indicators that look like someone's rotating a pre-made asset, especially when it's off-center. Just awful. We're going to be using a really simple technique that divorces us completely from the complications of making these segments of our indicators fade out directly, allowing us to concentrate on the design of the segments to make them look just the way we want. First, let's throw together something that might be considered a stereotypical circular indicator. As you may know, I like to make my designs size agnostic where possible, so we're going to be using a geometry reader to facilitate that. And we're going to have 12 segments in this indicator, and then in a Z stack, we're going to loop over them, index in, and each one of our segments is simply going to be a capsule, the size of which is going to be a scaled version of the frame itself. Frame, geo, size scaled, and then we can scale the width and the height here by saying 0.25 and 0.06. So that gives us 0.25 of the width and 0.06 of the height. Then we need to offset it in the X direction. X offset, and we're going to offset that by a scaled version of the width, 0.37. And now we need to rotate each segment. Normally, to find the rotation of each segment, we divide 360 by the number of segments and iterate the rotation by that amount, which is what I'll be doing for the native implementation. As a brief flex to the power of PureSwiftUI though, which will also be part of PureSwiftUIDesign that is now in beta, link in the description, I'm going to calculate the fractional change in rotation for each segment, which we'll call fractional rotation per segment. And that's equal to 1 over the number of segments as a double. Now we can rotate each element by calculating the fraction of a full rotation and applying that to the cycle extension on angle, like this. We take the fractional rotation per segment, we multiply that by the index as a double. This is an extremely powerful extension because it means you can think of angles simply as fractions of a single rotation, which is much simpler than worrying about how many degrees there are in a circle. And yes, that is basic geometry, but sometimes you just don't want to have to think about how many degrees you need to rotate something in order to rotate it to the opposite side, for example. Okay, there are our segments. And as you can see, this is off to the top left of the geometry reader. You might not be aware of this, but the layout of a geometry reader view behaves just like a greedy Z stack with an alignment of top leading. In order to center our activity indicator, therefore, we need to make sure we are filling the entire thing. We can achieve this in a variety of ways, but let's just put a clear color at the bottom, which is itself a greedy view, and will therefore push out the Z stack, achieving our goal. For more details on geometry readers, please take a look at my episode on that very topic. Now we've got our indicator, we need to animate it, and for that, we're going to use a mask. So let's make it its own view to give us something we can reuse, and we'll call it Circular Activity Indicator Mask. The content of this view is going to be an angular gradient. Masks work based on the alpha or the transparency, so it doesn't matter what color you choose. I like to use red because it usually stands out nicely against the view you're masking, making it easier to work with. The gradient colors are going to be going from clear to red, which we'll come back to a bit later. And let's set the angle to be at the top. There's no need to restrict it to a circle when using it as a mask, so we're just going to use the gradient in its raw form like that. A nice trick to make masks easier to work with is to develop them as a background or an overlay for whatever you're masking, so you can see what you're doing. In fact, a really efficient way of working like this is to have both modifiers, the background and the mask, on their own lines and comment out the appropriate one to switch between states. So we'll add mask to this line and then comment that out. And we'll put background on this line, and then we're going to add our view here. Circular Activity Indicator Mask. So now I can switch between mask and background by just commenting out one of those lines. So now we can resume and see what we've got. Lovely. Notice that although the gradient is transitioning from clear to red, it sort of goes through this gray, ugly region. That's perfectly fine and expected since the clear color has no saturation associated with it, so it's essentially black with an opacity of 0. All a mask cares about is the transparency, not how it looks, so this will work no problem. I, however, do care about how it looks. Personally, when you have the mask transitioning in one color, I think it makes it clearer, if you'll excuse the pun. So what I'm going to do is stick a quick extension on color here and add a static constant for clear red, which is the red color, with an opacity of 0. Then I can use that instead of clear and resume, and our mask looks a lot nicer. Anyway, let's animate it, and for that we'll need a state variable for the animation state, which will determine whether or not the view is animating. And we'll initialize that to false. When that view appears, we'll set that to true inside an animation block, which is going to be a linear animation with a duration of 1 second, and we'll repeat it forever with auto reverses set to false. And now we need to change the angle based on whether or not we're animating. If we are animating, we rotate 360 degrees. If we're not, we don't rotate at all. Now all we need to do is comment out background, uncomment mask. Now we can resume and play. And isn't that wonderful? Now there is a slight problem here in that we can see the transition in that mask. What we're going to do to hide that is just add a blur, the radius of which is going to be the width scaled by 0.05. And there we are. That softens up that transition nicely. And if I run this, you don't notice the transition. However, you can see that because we're going right to the edge with these segments, the blur is actually bleeding into our mask here. What we need to do is increase the size of that mask by scaling it. You can either do that in the mask itself or inline here, which is what I'm going to do. Scale 1.2. And that solves that problem nicely. Now, as the segments of the indicator occupy greater and greater arc lengths, and if I set this to 0.12, you can see what I'm talking about, is that the boundary problem of the mask becomes one that you simply can't hide by blurring it. That requires a different approach that we're going to look at in part 3. It will be rather advanced and get right into the nitty-gritty of the animatable protocol, but will be well worth the watch if you want to solidify your understanding of how animations work in SwiftUI, so be on the lookout for that. So let's go back to where we were, and let's talk about another aspect of this, and that is the fading out of the mask. Let's say we wanted to fade it out more quickly, so it doesn't go all the way around the circle. If we go down here, we can see that we're using clear and red as an array. And first I'm going to separate out these colors so we can see what's going on. And then I'm going to comment out the mask and uncomment the background. The simplest way of changing this would probably be increase the number of clears and reds and let the framework sort it out. So I could add another clear color here, and that would push around the transition because there are 2 clears and 1 red. If I say added another 2 reds, then you can see that it pushes around in favor of the reds. But there is a small problem with this approach. Can you see how harsh that transition is getting? Okay, so it goes from almost completely solid red and then very quickly goes to clear. This is not really what we want. We want it to transition gradually, not have these big steps. So the way we're going to do that is by using gradient stops. And you might be thinking that using gradient stops is incredibly wordy, and it is. This is why I made the whole process a lot easier in PureSwiftUI, because all you have to do is use an array of tuples, the second value of which is the fraction where you want the stop to be. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to get rid of these extra reds and a clear, and then we're going to add these as tuples. I'm going to put a comma in, and then I'm just going to say 1 for red and 0 for clear. And now we have full control. So I can just tell it exactly where I want it to fade to clear. Let's say 0.5. There you are. It fades gradually from the top right round to the bottom. And I think 0.4 would actually be quite nice for this. So if I go up here, I put the mask back, I take out the background, and then we play, we can see that it fades out and it takes about 0.6 of the circle to do that. And now we're using gradient stops. You have a lot of flexibility as to where you want this fading out to stop. In fact, you can set it as a property of the mask if you like, which you would not be able to do if you were using an array of colors to define these boundaries. And now that we're pretty much done, let's just make sure that this does work in a size agnostic way. And then if I play that, you see that they all behave just as we expect, regardless of the size of the indicator. But that's it for now, and in the next episode, we're going to be looking at applying this technique to horizontal and vertical activity indicators. So join me for that. It's going to be brilliant. If you like that, don't forget to like the video. It really helps boost the infamous YouTube algorithm and puts a smile on my face. And if you're not already subscribed and you want to see more of this kind of thing, including the rest of this exciting series, consider doing that. It might just be the best decision you make this year. Probably not, but you never know. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.